Forget the barbarians. Forget the plagues. Forget the decadent emperors and their lavish orgies. The real killer of the Roman Empire wasn't an invading horde or a mysterious disease. It was far more insidious, far more subtle, and frankly, far more terrifying, because it was a weapon Rome wielded against itself. It was a fatal mistake of the highest order, one driven by perceived necessity, economic illusion, and ultimately, a profound misunderstanding of what gives a currency its power. And if you think this is just a dusty history lesson, a quaint tale from a bygone era, then you haven't been paying attention. Because that same fatal mistake, that precise, self-inflicted wound, is playing out right now, in real time, with the very currency you use every single day, the US dollar. You see, empires, no matter how grand, how powerful, how seemingly invincible, are ultimately built on trust. And nowhere is that trust more vital, more foundational, than in their money. Rome lost that trust. And the dollar, my friends, is treading a path eerily similar to the one that led the greatest empire the world has ever known. Not to a sudden, dramatic collapse, but to a slow, agonizing economic strangulation. This isn't just a story about ancient coins. It's a chilling prophecy for modern bills. Imagine Rome at its zenith, a sprawling colossus, stretching from the deserts of Africa to the misty shores of Britannia, from the sun-drenched vineyards of Gaul to the bustling markets of the East. Its legions were unmatched, its engineering breathtaking, its legal system revolutionary. But underpinning it all, the true sinews of its power, was a remarkably stable and widely accepted currency, the denarius. This wasn't just any coin. It was a symbol of Roman might and integrity. For centuries, the denarius was a beacon of stability. Minted predominantly from pure silver, it was a currency you could trust. A soldier knew his pay was good. A merchant knew his profits were real. A citizen knew his savings would hold their value. This wasn't some abstract financial concept. It was the tangible bedrock of Roman society, enabling trade, taxation, and the colossal logistical feats required to maintain an empire of such staggering scale. But empires, like all living things, are dynamic. They grow, they face challenges, and they incur costs. Rome was no different. Endless wars of expansion, maintaining those legions across vast distances, constructing magnificent infrastructure, financing ambitious public works, providing for its ever-growing population. All of it required immense resources, and sometimes those resources weren't immediately available. The coffers, no matter how full, always seemed to demand more, especially when ambitious emperors decided to throw lavish games, build new monuments to their own glory, or fund ever-increasing social programs to keep the populace docile and distracted. The pressure was constant, relentless. And this, my astute viewers, is where the fatal mistake began. When the demands for spending outstripped the available supply of precious metals, the actual wealth of the empire, a dangerous temptation arose. A whisper in the ears of emperors and their advisors. What if we just stretched it a little? What if, instead of raising taxes, which was always unpopular, or cutting spending, which was politically suicidal, they found a third way? A way to create more money without actually having more wealth. Enter debasement, the Roman Empire's secret weapon turned self-destruct mechanism. It wasn't some grand, nefarious plot hatched in a smoky back room. It began subtly, incrementally. The first few emperors to dabble in this dark art didn't drastically alter the coinage overnight. No, that would have been too obvious, too alarming. Instead, they'd shave off a tiny bit of silver, replace it with a cheaper metal like copper, and then mint more coins. The coins still looked like denarii. They still bore the emperor's face. They still felt like money. But the intrinsic value, the actual silver content, had been diminished. The justification was always rational, always seemingly logical. We need to pay our soldiers. We need to fund this vital campaign. We need to keep the economy moving. And initially, it worked. More coins flowed into the economy. The treasury seemed fuller. Debts could be paid. Everyone felt a temporary relief. It was like a drug, a quick hit of artificial prosperity. The emperor could fund his projects, the soldiers got paid, and the people, for a time, were none the wiser. They still spent their silver coins, oblivious to the fact that each one carried a little less actual silver than the last. They were trading an illusion of wealth for real goods and services, and the state was pocketing the difference. But here's the cruel irony. Every time they debased the currency, they were, in effect, robbing their own citizens. They were eroding the very trust that money relied upon. They were stealing purchasing power from their people, from their soldiers, from their merchants, from everyone who held those coins. And they were doing it silently, insidiously, without a single declaration of war or a visible tax hike. It was a hidden tax, a stealth expropriation that few understood in its early stages. The denarius, once a shining symbol of stability, began its long, tragic decline, a slow, agonizing bleed that would eventually prove terminal. And Rome, proud, powerful Rome, was now firmly on a path where the perceived solution to its financial woes was actively undermining the very foundation of its economic stability. The stage, my friends, is set. The initial subtle debasement, like a minor cut, soon became a gaping wound. What began as a convenient fiscal trick quickly morphed into an addiction. Each time the Roman state needed more money, and it always needed more money, the easiest path, the path of least political resistance, was to simply dilute the currency further. Emperor after emperor, faced with an endless array of crises, military campaigns, civil wars, lavish building projects, feeding a bloated capital, succumbed to the siren song of the mint. A little less silver here, a little more copper there, then a lot less silver, then hardly any silver at all. By the 3rd century AD, the denarius, once nearly pure silver, was a ghost of its former self. It wasn't just shaved, it was essentially gutted. The silver content plummeted from around 90% to less than 50%, then to 20%, then to a paltry 5%, or even 2%. The shiny coins that left the imperial mint were little more than bronze slugs with a thin wash of silver, a metallic lie. The illusion, once subtle, was now glaringly obvious to anyone with eyes. It was like swapping out a solid gold watch for a cheap plastic knockoff, but insisting they were exactly the same. Spoiler alert, they weren't. And this, my friends, is where the wheels truly came off. The market, that vast, intelligent, and utterly unforgiving beast, wasn't fooled for long. People aren't stupid. Merchants, soldiers, and everyday citizens could feel the value draining from their pockets, even if they couldn't articulate the nuances of monetary policy. They understood one thing. A coin that bought a loaf of bread today bought half a loaf tomorrow, and maybe just a crumb the day after. Inflation, the silent destroyer of wealth, began to rage. Prices skyrocketed, not because goods were scarce, but because the money used to buy them was abundant and worthless. If you were a Roman soldier, your pay, once a stable silver denarius, was now a handful of near-worthless slugs. Would you fight with the same zeal? Would you maintain your loyalty to an emperor who paid you in effectively monopoly money? Not for long. The legions, the very backbone of Roman power, began to lose morale, their discipline eroding as their purchasing power vanished. Farmers, who once brought their surplus to market for a fair price, found that by the time they sold their produce and went to buy something else, their profits had been eaten away by rising prices. Why bother? Why produce more than you needed for yourself? This discouraged trade, paralyzed commerce, and crippled the very economic engine that kept the empire running. The once vibrant markets, bustling with goods from across the known world, became sluggish, hesitant. Barter, that primitive form of exchange, began to make a comeback, not out of choice, but out of necessity. People preferred to trade actual goods, actual value, rather than accept the emperor's increasingly dubious coinage. The government, in a desperate attempt to maintain the charade, introduced new denominations: the Antoninianus, the Argenteus, the Fallis. Each new coin was supposed to fix the problem, to restore trust, but each was quickly debased, following the same fatal trajectory. It was a vicious cycle. Debased to pay for crises, inflation surges, people lose trust, the economy slows, tax revenues fall, new crises emerge, necessitating more debasement. The Roman state was essentially running a giant, multi-century Ponzi scheme on its own currency. And then came the inevitable, catastrophic government intervention, a desperate gasp from an empire suffocating under its own economic policies. In 301 AD, Emperor Diocletian, a man who saw chaos and sought order with an iron fist, issued his infamous Edict on Maximum Prices. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a decree. He fixed the prices of thousands of goods and services, from grain and wine to skilled labor and haircuts. The penalty for charging more than the edict allowed? Death. Diocletian, like so many leaders before and since, believed he could legislate economic reality into submission. He thought he could command prices to stop rising, that he could force his debased currency to hold value by imperial decree. Think about that for a moment. An emperor, fed up with rampant inflation, tries to solve it by threatening to kill anyone who acknowledges the true, reduced value of his money. The sheer arrogance, the economic illiteracy is breathtaking. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. No surprise there. Markets simply went underground. Goods disappeared from official channels, sold instead on black markets at their true, inflated value. Those who abided by the edict quickly went out of business. Production plummeted. Famine loomed as farmers refused to sell at artificially low prices. Diocletian's edict, far from stabilizing the economy, accelerated its collapse into chaos, demonstrating that no amount of imperial might can override the fundamental laws of supply, demand, and trust. The Roman economy wasn't just sick, it was on life support, its currency a worthless husk. The military, unable to rely on consistent pay, resorted to plunder or demanded payment in actual goods. Civil servants were paid in kind, rations of grain, clothing, whatever the state could get its hands on. The intricate, sophisticated financial system that once underpinned the greatest empire the world had ever known was dissolving into a fragmented, localized mess of barter and forced exchanges. The very fabric of society, once held together by the reliable thread of the denarius, was unraveling. Rome had, through its own misguided pursuit of easy money, systematically destroyed the foundation of its wealth, power, and ultimately, its cohesion. And the cost, dear viewer, was far greater than any barbarian invasion could ever inflict. So, what happened to Rome? Did the barbarians suddenly become unstoppable? Did the plagues wipe out their will to fight? Not exactly. The empire continued to exist, in various fragmented forms, for centuries after its currency became a joke. But it was a shadow of its former self. The debasement, the inflation, the economic chaos. These weren't the direct cause of a single dramatic collapse. They were the slow, systemic poisoning that weakened Rome from within, making it utterly incapable of responding to the external pressures that eventually overwhelmed it. When your soldiers are paid in worthless metal, when your merchants abandon trade for barter, when your tax base shrinks because no one has real wealth to tax, when your people distrust the very coins in their pockets more than they fear an invading Goth, that empire isn't defeated by an enemy, it defeats itself. It loses its ability to project power, to innovate, to maintain infrastructure, to even feed its own citizens. It becomes a hollow shell, ripe for the taking. The denarius didn't just lose its value, it lost Rome, its future. It eroded the very fabric of society, paving the way for political instability, civil war, and ultimately, fragmentation. Rome didn't fall because of strong enemies. It fell because its money, and thus its trust, became weak. It was a slow, agonizing descent into irrelevance, punctuated by the final, symbolic sacking of a capital that had long since surrendered its economic soul. Now, pause for a moment. Take a deep breath. Because if you've been listening, if you've been truly absorbing the chilling echoes of that ancient narrative, then you should feel a cold knot forming in your stomach. You should be looking at your own wallet, at the digital numbers in your bank account, with a profound sense of unease. Because we, my friends, are living through a similar, albeit technologically advanced, replay of Rome's fatal mistake. The stage has been reset, the actors have changed, but the script? Oh, the script is unnervingly familiar. The US dollar. The supposed bedrock of the global financial system. The undisputed heavyweight champion currency for decades. For generations, the dollar represented stability, trust, and American power. Born from the ashes of World War II, solidified at Bretton Woods, backed for a time by gold, it became the world's reserve currency. Nations held their wealth in dollars. Trade was settled in dollars. Oil was priced in dollars. It was the denarius of the modern age, a testament to American economic might and, crucially, integrity. But like Rome, empires incur costs. And like Rome, the pressures mounted. Endless wars, colossal social programs, maintaining a global military presence, financing ambitious domestic projects, stimulating the economy through every conceivable crisis. The demands on the coffers, no matter how vast, always seem to outstrip the available supply of actual, underlying wealth. And this is where our modern debasement truly began. Not with clipping silver from coins, but with something far more abstract, far more insidious. The severing of the dollar's final tether to any real-world asset. In 1971, President Nixon famously closed the gold window, effectively ending the dollar's convertibility to gold. It was hailed as a necessary step, a move to free the American economy from the shackles of an outdated monetary system. But what it really did was remove the last external discipline on the creation of money. Suddenly, the dollar became a pure fiat currency, backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the US government. And faith, as Rome learned, is a fickle thing. From that moment on, the printing presses, digital ones mostly, were free to run wild. The Federal Reserve, our modern-day imperial mint, gained unprecedented power to create money out of thin air, and they have used it extensively. Quantitative easing, stimulus packages, bailouts, crisis interventions. These are the euphemisms for our era's debasement. When the government spends trillions it doesn't have, the Fed doesn't raise taxes or cut spending. Oh no, that would be politically unpopular, just like in Rome. Instead, they accommodate the spending by buying up government debt, effectively injecting newly created dollars into the financial system. It's not silver being replaced by copper. It's genuine wealth being diluted by endless streams of digital zeros. The intrinsic value of each dollar, its purchasing power, is systematically eroded. The justifications are always rational, always seemingly logical. We need to stimulate the economy. We need to save the banks. We need to combat a recession. We need to pay for vital infrastructure. Sound familiar? These are the modern echoes of "we need to pay our soldiers" and "we need to fund this vital campaign." And initially, it works. Markets boom, asset prices soar, and everyone feels a temporary relief, a quick hit of artificial prosperity. The government funds its projects, the banks are saved, and the people, for a time, are none the wiser. They still spend their dollars, oblivious to the fact that each one represents a little less real-world value than the last. They are trading an illusion of wealth for real goods and services, and the state, through the invisible tax of inflation, is quietly pocketing the difference. But like Rome, the market, that vast, intelligent, and utterly unforgiving beast, isn't fooled forever. People aren't stupid. You feel it in your grocery bills. You feel it at the gas pump. You feel it when your savings account yields next to nothing while your rent skyrockets. The value is draining from your pockets, even if the financial pundits try to spin it as transitory or blame it on supply chains. Inflation, the silent destroyer of wealth, is raging again. Prices are skyrocketing, not primarily because goods are scarce, though supply shocks certainly don't help, but because the money used to buy them is abundant and losing its value. Your wages, like the Roman soldier's denarius, buy less and less, Would you work with the same zeal? Would you maintain the same trust in a system that pays you in effectively monopoly money? Not for long. The government, much like Diocletian, has begun its own desperate interventions, albeit more subtly. Instead of edicts on maximum prices, we get Inflation Reduction Acts that achieve the opposite, or central banks targeting inflation rates they consistently miss. We get political pressure on corporations to lower prices, or accusations of price gouging when the real culprit is a debased currency. These are attempts to legislate economic reality into submission, to command prices to stop rising, to force a diluted currency to hold value by rhetorical decree. Spoiler alert, it won't work. Markets, both domestic and global, are already seeking alternatives. The most alarming parallel? The erosion of global trust in the dollar. Nations around the world, witnessing the massive accumulation of US debt, now soaring past $34 trillion, an unthinkable number, and the weaponization of the dollar through sanctions, are growing increasingly wary. They're diversifying. They're seeking alternatives. The BRICS nations are openly discussing common currencies. Countries like China and Russia are settling trade in local currencies. Saudi Arabia is considering non-dollar oil sales. This isn't just geopolitical maneuvering. It's the modern equivalent of Roman merchants preferring barter over a silver-washed bronze slug. It's the market, the global market, saying, "We prefer actual value over your increasingly dubious promises." The US is trapped in a debt spiral eerily similar to Rome's. We need more money to service our colossal debt, to fund our military, to pay for social programs. The easiest path, the path of least political resistance, is to simply print more. But each new dollar printed dilutes the value of every existing dollar, further fueling inflation and further eroding trust. The perceived solution to our financial woes is actively undermining the very foundation of our economic stability, just as it did for Rome. We are running a giant, multi-decade Ponzi scheme on our own currency, and the world is starting to notice. So, where does this leave us? History, they say, doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. The Roman Empire's story is not merely a tale of barbarians at the gate. It's a cautionary epic about self-inflicted wounds, about the insidious power of debased money to unravel the very fabric of an empire. Their fatal mistake wasn't a lack of resources, but a fatal misunderstanding of what money truly is. Not a tool for endless manipulation, but a sacred trust, a store of value, and a medium of exchange. When that trust is betrayed, when that value is systematically eroded, the consequences are predictable, catastrophic, and historically inevitable. The dollar, today, stands at a crossroads. Will we learn from Rome's agonizing decline, or are we destined to follow the same path, blinded by short-term political expediency and the illusion that we can print our way to prosperity indefinitely? The question isn't whether the dollar will disappear overnight. It's whether it will slowly, agonizingly, lose its status, its power, and ultimately, its ability to underpin the society it serves, just as the Denarius did. The real barbarians aren't at the gate. They're in the mint, digitally debasing the very foundation of our wealth. Your financial future, your savings, your purchasing power, all depend on understanding this ancient, yet terrifyingly current lesson. Ignore it at your peril. If this video gave you value, hit like, subscribe, and share it with anyone who appreciates this kind of content.